a.m., February, 1945, Iwo Jima. A squad from K Company, 3rd Battalion, steps off the pumice into a black mouth in the rock, one of 1,000 caves punched into the island's ribs. They just burned 2 spider holes with a flamethrower and stacked 6 Japanese charred helmets outside. The cave should be empty. It isn't. The tunnel smells of cordite and hot sulfur. Corporal Joe Mendez is on point, carbine up, flashlight taped under the barrel. Behind him, a demolition pair hauls a satchel charge, and the flamethrower man sweats behind an M2 tank that weighs as much as sin. The passage dips, widens, then pinches to a corridor barely shoulder wide. 90 feet in, the light finds a T-junction. Left branch is collapsed. Right branch ends in a neat, square wall of fresh basalt, tool marks still sharp. Dead end, Mendez says, turning to signal the team to back out. The dead end breathes. A faint hiss bleeds from the rock. A wire glints in the flashlight's edge. A click answers down the corridor behind the Marines where they just passed. 2 vents hidden in the ceiling iris open. A clay jar improvised tear gas shatters at their ankles. The flamethrower man coughs, staggers. In the same heartbeat, a Type 99 rifle cracks from a fist-sized firing slit cut waist-high behind a veneer of cinders. The point man folds. Another shot. A third. The narrow walls turn the cracks into hammer blows. Grenades roll in from a side sap the Marines never saw. The tunnel heaves. The satchel carrier slumps over his own charge, and the flame tank's hose flails like a struck snake, spewing raw gasoline that doesn't ignite only because the air is too poor to feed it. In under 20 seconds, 6 Americans are down in a passage that didn't exist on the map 3 minutes ago. When the survivors crawl back coughing black, the radio men above ground hear it first. Monster in the tunnels, multiple shooters were cut. The name sticks. Over the next 4 days, patrols from the 3rd Marine Division call the same voice on SCR 536 seconds. Asterisk, Tunnel Monster, active near Hill 362B. Tunnel Monster, in the quarry. Monster hit our stretcher team by the Minami roadblock. Asterisk. Intelligence draws a red question mark over a patchwork of caves between Turkey, Knob, and the amphitheater, and writes 2 words in grease pencil. Dead end. It wasn't a Japanese unit, as Americans thought. It was one man. His real name never made it to any report. The Japanese 109th Division's rosters burned with their command post on the Motoyama Ridge. Marines who saw him and lived described a small, wiry soldier in a salt-stained tunic, face blackened with soot, moving with the automatic economy of someone who built the ground he fought under. He carried a Type 99 Arasaka with a cut-down stock, a pouch of blasting caps in a tobacco tin, and a coil of telephone wire looped twice around his waist. The move he used had a nickname among the sappers of Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi's garrison. Asterisk, Shibari Kabe times the tide wall. Americans would remember it as the dead-end trap. The math favored him. The island's tunnel grid, more than 11 miles of galleries through welded ash, let a single defender open a fight from 3 angles without ever showing his body. He baited patrols with a purposeful blank. A fresh facade mortared into place at the end of a straight run. A scuffed boot print in dust. A faint draft where there shouldn't be one. He let Marines commit past a side sap cut low, past a screened slit bored through pumice at knee height, then triggered the trap. A wire-yanked shutter, revealing a loophole at their backs. A jar of irritant gas down a gravity vent, and shots into a crowd packed shoulder to shoulder by geology. In the volcanic dark, 5 men became one target. By nightfall, the division hacks a new line into their sitrep. Asterisk. Avoid pursuit into apparent dead ends. Expect counterfire from rear saps and ceiling vents. Flamers only, with overwatch. Asterisk. But orders don't stop fear. Word passes from foxhole to foxhole on the slopes of Hill 382. The monster blocks tunnels with stone, and kills from behind the stone. Flamethrower teams, the most hated men in America's arsenal and the most hunted, start painting skulls on their tanks and refusing to enter any passage that breathes. And somewhere in the magma-cold undergut of Iwo Jima, a single soldier with a rifle and a mason's hands maps the next dead end with the calm of a man writing a name. They learned his habits the hard way. The monster didn't rush fights. He engineered them. He watched from the dark where Marines couldn't see him and let curiosity, American, inexhaustible, do the work. Patrols on Motoyama thought they were clearing a cave. They followed footprints and stale cigarette butts. They stepped over an unburned line of straw that looked like a trail. They read a fresh scrape in the mortar as proof someone had been there and moved forward, and the dead end welcomed them like an acceptably sealed tomb. The trap's construction was brilliant in its simplicity. First, he dressed an alcove with a false face, a square of fresh basalt, mortared into a rough keystone, a faint smear of cooking oil to suggest a recent fire, a tobacco-papered packet left conspicuously at ankle height. That signal bait was the same every time something small and human that screamed, "We left here moments ago." A Marine would stop, kneel, maybe probe the alcove with a bayonet. That second, perfectly measured, was his window. What followed combined old demolition craft with volcanic geometry. Hidden behind the false face sat a slotted firing hole angled to the passage behind. The defender never had to risk exposing himself to shoot at men at the mouth of the trap. A wire ran from the lintel to a hand-operated pulley in a side gallery. When pulled, the slot's shutter retracted, and an inner embrasure opened like a mouth. At the ceiling, a clay jar filled with a choking mix of powdered pepper, sulfur, and a little leftover smoke match residue hung on a hinge. A single yank and the jar shattered, filling the low tunnel with tears. Gagging and blinding men pressed shoulder to shoulder. If flares marked the mouth, he had a counter. A pit filled with burned mats and spent rice husks that smoldered rather than burned, spitting hot embers and choking smoke that made the passage feel like a furnace while he fired through a cool slit. The effect was tactical and terrifying. A squad would funnel into a corridor 20 men deep by the time they realized they'd been deceived. The firing slit behind them turned the mass into a parade of targets. A grenade tossed into the mouth would detonate and ricochet, but not clear the embrasure, because the monster had engineered angled returns rockwork that funneled fragments away from his own positions and toward the intruders. Flamethrowers, America's answer to caves, proved unreliable in such confined, oxygen-poor systems. The monster understood combustion. He cut vents to starve fires of air, then opened them to suck smoke like a bellows when it suited him. Marines who thought the tunnel could be cooked out learned otherwise when their flame tanks coughed and their hoses froze, their bursts swallowed by a ceiling that didn't want to burn. Word spread faster than dispatches. Stretcher teams learned not to run the tunnels unless an infantry officer accompanied them with 2 riflemen. Medics started carrying gas masks in pockets where they'd never needed them before. Flamethrower crews painted skulls on the turret skirts and demanded that tanks remain on fixed overwatch whenever a passage looked even faintly suspicious. Recon patrols switched to a new ritual: probe with rods, test drafts, sniff the air, and send a man to check the flank entry by voice call before committing. Even then, they got hit. The enemy exploited the Marines' instincts, curiosity, duty, the compulsion to help a wounded comrade, and turned them into timing cues for murder. He didn't always fight alone. Sometimes the monster lured a squad into a dead-end chamber where 2 or 3 defenders lay in wait, trading fire and passing grenades through ventilation shafts. But most of the time, the myth exaggerated the numbers. The 3rd Marine Division's after-action reports talk about enemy activity, suggesting an organized tunneling group. Corps intelligence quotes battalion returns that record multiple contacts in identical circumstances and conclude the presence of a larger unit. The truth, whispered among men who survived, was different. One soldier, clever and patient, can create illusion by exploiting natural architecture. The monster became a force multiplier because he turned every cavern into a mirror of the next. Every false dead end a rumor that multiplied. He was ruthless about targets. Stretcher bearers were the worst. Medics moved predictably, slow and careful, pulling litters down the same corridors marked by the wounded. The monster learned which breaks in the rock funneled stretchers into the narrowest choke. He placed an embrasure to rake the shoulders and dropped the litter bearers before they could turn. He killed a corpsman who had refused to withdraw after the first shot. He'd been described later as a man who could not leave his friend. The division tallied losses in nights and hours. 20 men, 1 dawn, 14 the next night, small teams cut down like saplings in a wind. The Marines began to speak of a running body count and whispered a name tunnel monster in the same breath as fear. Countermeasures evolved painfully. Engineers brought percussion grenades with delayed fuses to force a defender to expose himself on a timing window. Platoons adopted twin-entry sweeps. One team would bait the trap by showing a visible presence and then withdraw while a second, masked and tethered with rope, went in from a different shaft to flush back to the origin. They tried blasting from above, dropping demolitions into skylights and chimneys. That worked. Sometimes tunnels collapsed into rubble like bad teeth, but it required explosives the division had in short supply and heavy risk to men watching for secondary detonations. They ransacked the island for signs of the monster's handiwork and found, under flashlight examination, the same marriage of artisan craft and lethal simplicity. Tools, scraps from a sapper's kit, clamps shaped by a cobbler's file. The faint smell of tobacco where the Japanese fighter had waited. He was patient. He moved like a miner with escape routes, pre-cut side galleries that returned to the same main trunk, small chutes for water runoff, shafts that opened into the scrub above the island's southern slopes. Marines who tried to follow found themselves on uneven rock, sliding out of sight and emerging hours later on the wrong side of the island. He used that geography like a private telephone network, wire loops tapped to the ceiling, guy lines tied to rock anchors, the same telephone wire that fed communication lines, now adapted to close a shutter or pull a vent. He wore the island like a second skin. When the division tried to engage him as a unit, they paid a grim price. A coordinated sweep of 5 companies once entered a mapped gallery and, thinking they had cornered a dozen defenders, moved in with bayonets glittering. The monster watched from a back sap and let the sweep advance until they were shoulder to shoulder. Then he tripped 2 shutters and cracked a dozen positions with precise rifle fire, while a team of snipers on the surface rained mortar onto the exit. The sweep lost men 12 in minutes, dozens wounded, and the survivors came out believing a whole battalion had ambushed them. The aftershock created the myth and hardened the fear that would fuel the monster's reputation. They eventually associated a number with him. 67, killed over several days. A grim toll attributed rightly or not to the dead-end tactic. The 3rd Marine Division's reports consolidated casualties across engagements and named his signature in the margins. Dead-end trap, avoid cords and false faces. Whether every death was his hand or the result of a dozen sappers working similar methods, the effect on Marine tactics was immediate. Tunnel clearance turned from a rolling sweep to a slow, methodical siege. Engineers pioneered new tools, probe rods with camera lenses, longer fuses for delayed charges, and post-breach gas venting rigs. But every innovation cost time, and time on Iwo Jima was measured in blood and men. The monster mastered misinformation too. He'd sometimes leave a trail of boot prints leading to one gallery, then sit quietly in a side sap and listen as Marines followed the wrong path. He understood the Americans' eagerness to finish a job. He could make them act predictably. A flamethrower would roar into a false face. The monster would open the vents to choke the weapon's flame and gun the man who leaned forward to look. At night, his figure small, stooped, might sprint a short distance and leave a smear of coal on a rock. Patrols would fixate. and he would take another 10 Marines with a single shot from a slit they had not thought to clear. He became more than a tactic. He became a terror calculus for mission planning. Commanders estimated an additional hour per cave for clearance, sometimes 2. They rationed supplies differently, kept medic detachments farther back, and shifted their operational tempo. When High Command tightened timelines, that pressure fed back to the lines. Marines moved faster, made mistakes, and fed the monster more opportunity. In a theater where every yard cost lives, that psychological weapon fear was as valuable as any mine or mortar. They would eventually try to flush him with heavy bombardment and coordinated fire from naval guns. The Navy's 14-inchers pounded ridges, and artillery poured tons of steel into the island's entrails. Some galleries collapsed, others echoed with the sounds of falling rock and the screams of men caught unawares. A bombardment in late February blew tin roofs and cave mouths outward and buried a string of small chambers. Some survivors on both sides reported seeing smoke and fragments fly from inside a particular gallery, and later found a smoldering trench where a man had lain. The rumor filtered down. The monster gone, lost to an errant shell or a sudden collapse. But the truth, like so much on Iwo, is messy. Marines who read patterns swore the monster was killed in that barrage. Others claimed a silhouette seen slipping under a boulder afterward. The Japanese records are thin. Kurabayashi's logs burned, regimental rosters scattered, and the man's name, if it ever existed in a command roll call, vanishes in the ash. For those left alive, he had a nickname and a body count, and that was enough. The tunnel monster might have been a single genius of ambush, or the concentrated legend of many small sappers who learned the same lethal craft. Either way, for days he bent the island to his will and taught Marines what every book and training manual could not. The ground could fight back, and if you treated the tunnels like a battlefield you could not see, you died like a man who had walked into a mouth. March 1st, 1945. Iwo Jima is burning. The sulfur smoke clings to skin like oil. Every ridge has been shelled, every cave flamed, every trench filled twice with the dead and refilled by the living. Marines of the 21st Regiment think the tunnel monster is gone, buried under an airstrike near the northern ridges. Then, just before dawn, a demolition team disappears in a cave complex north of Hill 362A. When a rescue patrol enters 2 hours later, they find nothing but scattered gear and 2 flamethrower tanks melted into the rock. The rumor spreads instantly. He's alive. By this point, the monster has become both myth and strategy. Marine reports describe him as a phantom who could move through solid rock. Engineers swear they've sealed tunnels only to find them open again by morning. The battalion intelligence officer, Captain McKeon, starts plotting where the disappearances happen. The dots make a line, a looping corridor beneath the plateau, nearly a mile long, intersecting abandoned shafts and storage caverns. He realizes what they're dealing with isn't random, it's deliberate. The monster has built his own hunting ground. In the dark maze, the Japanese soldier, still nameless in every record, has adapted. The first dead-end trap used a false wall. Now, he uses the tunnels themselves. When the Americans block one entrance, he digs a bypass and sets a lure. The new version of the trap is even worse. Marines called it the loop. Here's how it worked. The tunnel splits ahead, one branch clearly sealed with debris, the other open and inviting. A Marine patrol would pick the open one. It always looked safer. But 20 yards in, it curved gently, imperceptibly, back toward the blocked passage. In the middle of that curve was a small chamber with a knee-high wall of rock, the perfect rifle rest. When the Americans reached what they thought was a new section, they were walking straight back into their own footprints. The monster waited behind the rock and fired into their backs at 5 paces. He'd perfected timing. He'd listened for the clatter of boots, the metallic rasp of rifles brushing stone, the soft murmur of English voices. He didn't need to see them. Sound told him everything. One boot scraping, then the next a rhythm. He waited until that rhythm filled the corridor, until the tunnel itself seemed to pulse with the sound of life. Then came the shots. Controlled, mechanical, never panic. 2, maybe 3, each placed by ear. He didn't need light. The Marines' own flashlights painted their death. Then, silence. The monster moved back through a drainage shaft and vanished. Over those few days, the 3rd Marine Division counted 17 separate contacts, all fitting the same pattern. Short bursts of accurate fire from behind, apparent dead ends, patrols wiped out, no survivors, no recovered enemy bodies. Each time, the trap was rebuilt within hours. Engineers filled the holes with explosives, collapsed the tunnels, and marked them with yellow tape. The next morning, new air drafts were blowing from the same direction, and the same trick awaited the next team. The monster wasn't just using the island, he was rebuilding it faster than they could destroy it. By March 3rd, the division's Combat Engineer Battalion tried a new tactic: thermite grenades to melt tunnel interiors and seal rock faces. But the monster countered even that. He'd constructed wooden braces inside his favorite galleries when thermite burned through. The collapsing debris piled into stable rubble, preserving narrow crawl spaces under the wreckage. Marines thought the tunnel was dead. He crawled through the ashes hours later. It was a duel of physics and patience, and the man in the dark was winning. Every survivor described the same feeling: silence, pressure, and then sound that didn't belong underground. The pop of glass breaking, the whisper of something sliding, then gunfire from nowhere. A radio operator named Tom O'Hara wrote later, "It was like the tunnel itself shot at us." The monster's trap turned space against the invader. He used air as his ally. When grenades exploded, he'd already opened vents to channel the blast away from his position. When flamethrowers roared, he closed them, starving the flame of oxygen. He understood airflow better than any American engineer. Kuribayashi's men had mined this knowledge from decades of volcanic excavation. The monster turned it into warfare. What made him terrifying wasn't just skill, it was how personal it felt. Marines said they could hear him breathing, whispering something, sometimes laughing. Others said he left behind notes scratched into walls, short lines in Japanese, half hidden under soot. Translated later, they read like poetry and threat combined. "The mountain is my home. You are guests. You will not leave." The legend broke the routine of war. Normally, when a position was cleared, it stayed cleared. But on Iwo, that rule failed. The monster made Marines distrust the ground itself. They started throwing grenades into shadows just to be sure. Every dead end became a potential grave. Some units began refusing to enter tunnels altogether, calling for airstrikes instead. But air couldn't reach him. He was too deep, too careful, too smart. One afternoon, a squad from the 3rd Marine Engineers tried to bait him. They left a dummy, an empty uniform, stuffed with sandbags propped at a dead end. Then they waited with a motion sensor rigged from a sound detector microphone. It took 3 hours, but the bait worked. A single rifle shot cracked through the darkness, punching through the dummy's chest. When the team rushed forward, the tunnel was empty except for a single wire hanging from the ceiling, swinging. The shot had come from behind another false wall, one they'd walked past twice. He was still one step ahead. By then, the American nickname Tunnel Monster had turned into something close to superstition. Marines pinned lucky charms to their uniforms before tunnel duty. Some carried crosses. Others muttered that the island itself was haunted by the spirits of the Japanese dead. A war correspondent named Robert Sherrod wrote, "The men talk of him as if he were death given a rifle and a map." But the monster wasn't supernatural. He was methodical, disciplined, and utterly unafraid to die. The truth, as later found in fragments of Japanese engineering logs, paints the picture. One Sergeant Major Shoichi Ichimura, 109th Division, 145th Regiment. an engineer and foreman before the war, builder of tunnels, teacher of demolitions. When the American bombardment destroyed his platoon, he stayed underground, alone. For 2 weeks, he hunted through the same labyrinth he had built. He had no food, no water, but condensation, no radio contact, no orders. But he had purpose. For him, every Marine that stepped into the tunnels was an intruder into his creation. The dead-end trap wasn't just tactics, it was ownership. By March 4th, he'd accounted for 67 confirmed American dead, dozens more wounded. Each killed in darkness, each by the same illusion, a tunnel that lied. And he wasn't done yet. They tried to turn his own architecture against him. By the 4th week on Motoyama, the Marines stopped treating tunnels as singular problems and began treating them as a theater. Reconnaissance, engineering, suppression, then entry. Colonel Willis, hard, tired, smelling of cordite, issued standing orders. No one entered a gallery without a rope line, 2 runners posted outside, and a ring of mortars on pre-registered targets. Flamethrowers would fire only after ventilating shafts were forced open, and a pair of riflemen with fixed bayonets had checked the flank saps. The division would no longer be bait for a single clever man. That doctrine slowed the monster, but it didn't stop him. If anything, it made his work more exotic. He adapted like a man who had built the place and had the patience of stone. Where Marines expected to find a sealed face, he left a hairline draft and a single boot scrape. Where engineers collapsed a gallery with TNT, he left a narrow vestigial crawl beneath the rubble that only someone who knew the angles could find. He learned to read the new American rituals and to make them into timing devices of his own. The ropes, the mortars, the ropes again. When a rope team would shout, "Stand by," he timed a shutter's release to the shout and watched men freeze under the acoustic mark. Where they probed with poles, he laid a false floor of thin planking over a pit packed with spent shell casings and clay enough to catch a man's foot and throw him off balance into the embrasure he had opened. One night in early March, a Marine platoon followed procedure and cleared a dozen small galleries in sequence. Ropes taut, mortars ready. The monster watched and let them feel the success. They breached without loss, found only dead ends, and discarded Japanese rations. Confidence grew. The platoon's captain radioed back an optimistic line. That was when the monster struck his masterstroke. He set 3 dead-end faces in a row, each believable, each baited with the same human signal, a scrap of cloth, the heel print, a bit of tobacco. The platoon cleared the first and second. At the third, they relaxed enough to allow the demolitions man forward to plant a charge on what he thought was a false face. The monster detonated a delayed cap in the side gallery. Not enough to collapse the gallery, but enough to send down a choking plume of eggshell dust and sulfur. In that haze, 2 concealed firing slits opened, and a steady stream of rifle fire punched through the ropes. The platoon lost 9 men in minutes. The division's casualty rolls filled with names that night. Medics walked slower the next day. That incident forced another tactical shift. The Corps sent in specialists. Navy demolitions experts with thermite pots and longer burning charges, Marine combat engineers with probe cameras, primitive lenses on poles, and a small group from a 1st Engineer Battalion who'd learned to burn galleries by dropping heaving pots of burning pitch into skylights. When a shaft couldn't be taken, they attempted to take the gallery from above, dig a cut into the slope, insert a charged pipe, then collapse the intended chamber from the top. Those operations worked sometimes. They also revealed the monster's unwillingness to accept a single approach. He began to harvest the Americans' tools. In a raid on a shallow sap that had been misjudged for being empty, he and a partner, sometimes an unseen courier, captured a carbines, a satchel of TNT, a few rainproof flares. With those, he became more dangerous. He used captured wire to lay trip lines that mimicked American rope. He strung jerrycan fuse lines that would singe the skin of a man who leaned over a false lip. With a captured signal flare, he learned when Marines would expect light and then extinguished it by opening a vent, leaving them blind and vulnerable when they stumbled forward. The psychological toll was as lethal as his bullets. Patrols began reporting a smell, a faint mix of smoke and pickled fish before an attack. Men started taking turns on tunnel duty, 2 at a time, never more than one set entering a gallery on the same day. Some units passed up tunnels entirely and called for naval gunfire or aerial napalm instead. Those strikes did collapse galleries, and occasionally they killed defenders. But they also knocked the island into new configurations. Roofs fell, new voids opened, new drafts developed. The monster treated those as invitations. On March 7th, a combined operation nearly caught him. The Marines planned a classic hammer and anvil. A frontline battalion would force tunnels from the south, while a reserve regiment sealed exits on the northern slope, and heavy mortars and naval guns kept every known shaft under suppression. For 2 days the plan hummed like a machine, the island rattled with preparatory shots. Smoke lay in the gullies. Searchlights turned the night into dawn. Then the North Regiment reported bodies found near a collapsed entrance. They thought they'd finished him. 37 men were catalogued as killed or missing in the sweep that followed. Engineers counted the spent charges and celebrated a hard-earned victory. The radio nets buzzed with relief. 3 days later, while the division celebrated the supposed victory, 3 separate medical litter teams were wiped out trying to reach a different hilltop. The division's logs later stitched the events together with grim irony. While they pinched one end of the island, the monster had slipped through an unobserved shaft and struck in the least defended sector. He killed rescuers first, then the men who thought they could set a trap. That action, striking into the rear of an operation via a forgotten skylight, was classic insurgent warfare on a scale neither side had expected from a single soldier. The rumor that he could be a squad in human form hardened again into myth. Chaplains began to use his name when comforting men shaken by tunnel duty. "Don't let him pull you in," they told recruits. "You won't hear him. You'll only hear your mates." For the Marines, every march back across pumice became heavier, as if the island itself were weighing them down. Still, at some point the lethal genius of the dead-end trap burned itself into the division's doctrine. The engineers developed a checklist probe: sound, rod, rope, flares, delay, collapse, an 8-step ritual before any man went past a false face. It saved lives. It cost time. On Iwo, time meant more men dead. And beneath the island, in a half-lit chamber whose walls tasted of sulfur and rice, the man called the tunnel monster kept moving his hands over the rock, listening, measuring, and waiting for the next group who did not know how to be patient enough to live.